Welcome to Colonized Minds, the podcast. This is Elizabeth Guzman Arroyo.
This is Luke Gibbons.
And we are back after a few days off.
How's grad school treating you?
How's grad school treating me?
Yeah.
It's all right. At first, I wasn't a huge fan of it. It wasn't really challenging.
Is it more challenging now?
It's not necessarily that it's more challenging now. It's more I picked topics that I could expand upon.
Okay.
For my research.
What's your topic?
They're all correlated with like equity and inclusion in higher education.
Okay.
And so one of the topics that I found particularly fun was essentially researching culture centers and the historical origins of culture centers and why culture centers were created. And it was really interesting to find out that culture centers were only supposed to be temporary.
Yeah.
So essentially, the initial push in the 60s for culture centers was that they were going to be created for essentially dealing with what was occurring then and what's still occurring now in terms of oppression, systemic oppression for minoritized identities. But the push was in correlation with also having culture centers do structural change in campuses at universities.
What do you mean by structural change?
Like changing the policies, changing the procedures, changing the overall climate of higher education so that it would be equitable. So essentially working themselves out of a job.
Yeah, it's so funny. I literally was just having this conversation earlier today. Continue.
And so that was the original purpose. That was the drive, and that's what students were demanding in the 60s. Students and also some faculty and administrators. Except that culture centers ended up becoming co-opted by a lot of institutions. And what I mean by that is that their initial purpose wasn't actually allowed in its full completion. And so what I'm saying is that the part of the structural change that was critical, a critical component of culture centers, wasn't really considered, wasn't really happening in a sense. And still to this day, many institutions don't function under a model where their culture centers actually have input in their structure.
So, okay, let me, what do you attribute that to? Not necessarily now, but like during that time period. So it sounds like if I'm understanding you correctly, and I'm just kind of playing around because I actually understand you. I'm just for folks who may not understand you correctly. It sounds like what you're saying is that there was an original intention behind creating these cultural centers. These cultural centers were supposed to have systemic change, and they were supposed to kind of be able to infuse themselves into the institution in such a way to where they were not needed. And that was the request of students at that time and potentially faculty at that time. But once those cultural centers were actually on campus, the institutions themselves either never saw them in that way or chose not to engage with them in that way. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, that is a correct assessment. Or the funding wasn't there to support them doing that work.
Got you.
Yeah, which has been historically a problem for culture centers is lack of funding. So expecting one professional staff or students to run culture centers.
Yes.
Well, if you have just one professional staff or just students running culture centers, there isn't a lot of work that actually could be accomplished.
Yeah, that is an aspect.
Right, that's just one aspect.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because you can have all the funding in the world, but if you don't have individuals who see that maybe the way that they function is problematic, if you don't have people, it can be even tougher. That
is true. So yeah, that's only one aspect of it. But essentially finding out that information of what was actually the purpose of culture centers, of their creation and implementation, and how that hasn't occurred for the great majority of culture centers in the U.S. That was interesting information to find out. And a lot of the research that is out there on culture centers essentially depicts culture centers as a location, like a safe location for students to go and essentially to avoid like microaggressions, to avoid the harassment, the bias that's faced on a daily basis out in society, out in other campus areas, and then also providing programs and services. By that I mean there's like leadership programs, advocacy programs, services in terms of food insecurity, housing insecurity, referrals, etc. But again, was just one of the components that originally culture centers were created for. And so my research focuses on that.
Yeah.
But it also focuses on critical race theory. And there have been documents by other scholars put out there saying that culture centers, based off that model of just providing programs and services, do pass critical race theory. And yes, that argument could be made if you're just looking at the culture center. However, if you're looking at the culture center in relation to the college or university as a whole, it does not pass CRT. So my paper makes that argument that culture centers, through that model, do not actually pass critical race theory.
Interesting. So one of my questions would be, so this is the appreciative inquiry coming out. Are there examples of cultural centers that are serving that function?
That are serving that function?
Yes.
We are.
I meant other than us. and that also is saying like we the way in which we are modeled and the work that we are attempting to do is very much that. Our success is still in the process. Like there's still, we are still working. We have just structured ourselves in such a way to do that. But I was going to say, are there any others that are
right? So there's no research showing that there are others, including ours, because there's not necessarily research on ours, right? Yes. Besides what we know, what we do. But there are other institutions that do function in a way that they address systemic change. But the information that I know is based off like conversations with colleagues, conversations focused on their operational model. For example, the LGBTQ Center at Princeton functions in very much a way that they're creating systemic change. Now, they're creating it through, what word do I want to use? They're creating it in a way where essentially the folks working there were hired for one thing, which was programs and services.
Yeah, absolutely.
But their job that they're actually doing is something completely different.
Yes.
Right. And
I know about that.
So they were hired for programs and services, but what they're doing is programs and services plus joining a bunch of boards, joining a bunch of councils, a bunch of committees, right? Making relationships with key people in order to create the systemic change that they're trying to achieve.
Yes.
So I'm saying that to say that the culture center there itself functions under a completely different model than the institution created the culture center for.
Well, yeah. So that also gets into the actual, even not historical birth of cultural centers, but how each institution itself is very different in how it starts a cultural center and where that comes from. Mm-hmm. And I've seen this play out in a number of places. Why is a cultural center started? So was that cultural center, and we know a lot of cultural centers, most cultural centers started as like black cultural centers or black study centers, right? And originally that stuff is based out of student need, but a lot of that was students and faculty kind of saying this is the approach that we need to take. Anyway, at your institution, at your college, was this faculty that says this needs to be created? Was this created through student government? Was this created through what the community said was needed? Or was this something that the cabinet said, we are going to create this? But where that was birthed out of has a lot to do with what that center is going to look like.
Right.
Because, and we know this happens all the time with putting things together, and specifically with the idea of like hiring and those types of things, people are looking for themselves. They want to see themselves reflecting in whatever it is that they're attempting to do. And so that can very much have a sway in how those centers look or function.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why I say that my grad program's going okay.
Just okay.
Because the research itself, I very much am enjoying, because it's really interesting information. It's information that directly correlates with the work that I'm doing here, right? However, the course material, so everything outside of my research and papers, isn't as great, and it's not necessarily the fault of the program. It's just information that I already know. So it's review.
Yeah.
So yeah. That's how it's going. But again, like I'm saying, the research on culture centers is very, very much interesting. And what I said earlier isn't necessarily to deter that services and programs are bad. They very much do play a critical role. It's more to add on that historically the purpose of culture centers was not only to offer services and programs. And the reason why that was, like, there was another component besides just that for culture centers is that essentially if you're just offering services and programs, and the institution itself is not doing something else like to to critically alter the inequities that exist, then essentially you're creating a cycle.
Yeah.
So every year you'll get new students. Every year some students will leave. Every year you continue offering essentially similar programs and services to, in a sense, help students navigate the oppressive environment that they're in. But the oppressive environment continues to exist.
And there's also a pendulum effect that also exists there. And I've seen it play out in a number of different ways, which is cultural centers being very critical, very much doing that type of work that you're talking about, much more, I won't even say that, more activist type of work. And then that moving to more, what's the word I'm looking for? Food, fun, and dance. The consumable culture. Yeah, the consumable culture, which is we're going to put on these events that make people feel happy, that makes people feel good, and we'll justify it as saying like, well, it's non-threatening and it gets people in the door and it warms people up. And then we do that for a certain amount of time, typically until something bad happens, and then we go back into activist mode. So there's this constant pendulum that we're operating in as a center of responding to student needs based on the students that are coming in, as opposed to, as you say, or another way of putting it, how do you decentralize those efforts?
Right.
And that really ultimately is kind of what the purpose of, or I shouldn't say what the purpose of multicultural centers are. In what you're describing, it very much is about being able to decentralize those type of equity efforts. Mm-hmm. Because what you're saying is right now, under kind of people's current model, all of those efforts that are supporting students of color is being housed in one place. If those efforts are not necessarily housed in just that place, if those efforts are taking place everywhere, you're decentralizing that. And so every place is a safe place. And you could get to a point, if you have that infrastructure in place, where the physical space of a multicultural center isn't actually needed. That role can still be there to quarterback, maybe, or to tie efforts together. And then even there, the next step would be that even dissolves, because just with the way people are operating, it's automatically infused in the work. But it's about being able to decentralize those things.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting information. There's not a lot out there, which has been one of the more challenging aspects of doing this research. Is there's not a lot of research on culture centers in general. And one of the biggest criticisms of culture centers in the research that does exist is essentially that there's no guide, there's no manual on how to create a culture center or what culture centers should focus on, right? Mm-hmm. The closest you get to it is actually a book published by Dr. Lori Patton, in which she talks about a couple of different culture centers, the Latinx culture centers, Black culture centers, Native American culture centers, and Asian American culture centers. So she has a couple of scholars that she works with that are experts in those particular fields that write about those individual culture centers. And then in that book, there's also an introduction of an argument being made that culture centers should also teach about whiteness.
Yeah.
But besides that, there isn't a lot of information on culture centers. And again, the information on the individual culture centers that is in that book very much still contain information on just programs and services.
Yeah. That makes me think of a very interesting question. Isn't there something interesting about us having this cultural center conversation? And there's this feeling that it very much is... how do we represent this population, this population, this population, this population? And it's this idea of like continuing to like add things, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And part of what made me think that was when you mentioned the idea you mentioned the concept of whiteness. But you also mentioned that, they had to look at the Latinx community, they had to look at the Native American cultural center. So there were these specific cultural centers that were needed. And not necessarily the idea of a rounded multicultural center. Right.
And there have been arguments made for both for and against multicultural centers. Mm-hmm. Another component of my research is actually looking at individual culture centers and whether they function under different models. like I mentioned, they still very much heavily focus on programs and services. However, the really interesting aspect is that their programs and services tend to fall under 5 categories. And so essentially it's providing a safe haven, so a safe space on campus. It's providing leadership development opportunities, social justice education or political education, mentoring. The last one is providing cultural exploration. And so if you look at those 5 things, really what they're doing is providing identity development and academic confidence, right, through creating a sense of belonging at that campus. But it was really interesting because I expected these culture centers to operate in different ways depending on the specific needs of that
population.
Yeah, right, exactly, of that population. But what I found throughout the 4 culture centers, and I actually did research in addition to those 4 culture centers on the LGBT centers that have been being created and popping up over the last 20 years. And that also fit under the same 5 categories of programs and services. And so, yeah, so essentially what I'm trying to say is that I expected them to be different, and they were still the same categories.
There essentially is a template, and everyone is fitting into that template based off of their particular identity.
Right.
Or that particular population.
Right.
But it's still falling within that template, which gets to that question of if each of these individual populations is just still going through the same motions, it really gets to the idea of the utility of those.
The argument that could be made is that just because they have those 5 same categories doesn't mean that they don't do work that is critical for the specific identities.
Yes.
Right. So yes, they have those 5 same categories, but how they go about actually doing those 5 categories could be different from center to center. So
yes,
for example, if you're doing social justice education or political education, well, historically for the Latinx community, a lot of social justice education doesn't actually occur in K through 12 or from a family setting. So understanding like systems of oppression isn't fundamental for Latinx communities. There isn't that understanding oftentimes. And so the Latinx Culture Center, the Latinx Culture Centers that I've researched really focused on teaching about social justice and that aspect of realizing that systemic oppression really does exist and there's different layers of oppression and how they work together, right?
It's about being able to lift a veil to be able to see what is actually happening.
Right. Now, the research that I did on Black culture centers, well, that veil was already very much lifted. So a lot of the work in terms of social justice education and political education was how do you take that information and create change?
How do you connect as we talked about, how do you connect your experience with the experiences of others, and how do you position that to actually act?
And so the way that the work was being done was different, but it's still the same category of work.
Yeah. I just had this like kind of just moment of clarity as we were talking. This is really social justice geek talk.
Yeah, I know.
I feel like when I like hear people talk about like World of Warcraft or like Star Wars or like, CS people talk about like coding or something like that, I feel like this is people who are listening to this and don't have any whatever concept of social justice may feel like how I feel when I'm listening to like my friends talk about like coding or something.
And with that, I think we've run out of time.
We've probably gone overtime.
Do we have any announcements?
So we actually do. There's an event that's going to be going on December 6th, Coming Out of the Shadows, Undocumented, Unafraid. That is being hosted by the Rock Creek Multicultural Center, and that will take place from 12 to 1 p.m., and it'll be in the Building 5 common area. Following that, from 2 to 3:30, they'll be putting on a legal clinic similar to the one that we just hosted here at the Cascade campus, basically kind of an immigration know your rights workshop where they'll be talking about how to interact with ICE. Although they can't make any predictions, potential outcomes or ways that the legal system could move and change in the next coming months. So there will be some lawyers there talking about that. Also kind of how to avoid scams, because there are a lot of scams going on when it comes to reapplying and applying for deferred action. So that, again, will be taking place December 6th. It will be in Building 5 in the common area, and 12 to 1 will be Undocumented, Unafraid, and the legal clinic will be from 2 to 3:30.
Another announcement is that later this afternoon from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. in the QRC, so that would be in the Student Union second floor, They are hosting a webinar from the Pride Foundation for folks that are interested in applying for scholarships through the Pride Foundation. Again, that's a webinar that would help folks understand the application process and help give some tips for the application process through Pride Foundation. So MLK Day of Service is coming up. That will be January 16. And just like we did that last year through the Multicultural Center, we're partnering up with Community-Based Learning and Campus Compact of Oregon, essentially to collaborate on MLK Day of Service, in which different universities and colleges around the Portland metro area gather together to do service together. And this year it'll be hosted at Warner Pacific. So we're just asking folks to go online onto
Campus Compact of Oregon,
onto their website and register for MLK Day of Service. There will be a bus transportation provided from PCC to Warner Pacific. And we're going to be gathering there again with other universities and colleges to serve that day.
Last announcement, the Office of Equity and Inclusion is having a non-credit certificate program. That is something they actually just ran this past term. They're going to be running another cohort in the winter term. I believe they're running one for the discovery phase and for the understanding phase. The sessions are going to be February 22nd to March 22nd for the folks in the discovery phase, and from January 17th to February 14th for the understanding phase. And those will take place at Climb, room 207. Very important. Please register for those sessions. There is a cap. That cap is 15 for each cohort, but they are asking folks to go to My PCC, register for class. You can add or drop classes, and they have the CRNs for those. You should have received an email from Kim Baker Flowers, our Chief Diversity Officer, that goes into a little bit more detail, but just wanted to put that out there. It is a wonderful professional development opportunity. The more of us who have that, that discovery phase and that understanding phase, the more we're able to influence our campus climate. So I would definitely encourage folks who are looking for professional development opportunities to talk to your manager so that we can get you enrolled in those cohorts.
All right. So I think that's all of our announcements for today.
Yeah.
So this has been Elizabeth Guzman Arroyo.
This is Luke Gibbons
saying, so what if it's true?